So back to where we were. Then in chapter 11 now. The new social movements that appeared in the 1960s arose in societies already primed to think in identity terms and whose institutions had taken on the therapeutic mission of raising people's self-esteem. Up until the 1960s, concern with identity had largely been the province of those who wanted to actualize their individual potentialities. But with the rise of social movements, many people naturally came to think of their own aims and objectives in terms of the dignity of the groups of which they were members. So now it's a transition from individual dignity, which has its roots like in Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther, who Martin Luther King Jr. is named after, Martin Luther from the 16th century, and the Protestant Reformation, that kind of hard-won individual dignity versus something that Fukuyama now characterizes as dignity for a group, an identity group of which certain people are members. Okay. Research on ethnic movements around the world has shown that individual self-esteem is related to the esteem conferred on the larger group with which one is associated. Thus, the political would affect the personal. Okay. So here's an ambiguity in the rhetoric of Fukuyama. His tone suggests that this demand for the dignity of a group is somehow problematic, and he doesn't quite agree with it. He doesn't say so, but in tone it kind of sounds that way. But then he says, oh, but studies show that's true. That you can't have individual dignity unless the group with which you identify has dignity. So maybe is it that one does identify with a particular group that's problematic? That might be what he's suggesting. It's hard to pin him down. But of course, and then he says, the political would affect the personal. He says that's kind of a fact. Okay. And this harkens back to the slogan, the personal is political. This is especially prevalent in amongst feminist activists of the 1970s, that personal lived experience is political. And Fukuyama is going to talk about lived experience a little later in the chapter. So he'll get into that. Okay, so each movement represented people who had up to then been invisible and suppressed. Each resented that invisibility and wanted public recognition of their inner worth. So was born what we today label as modern identity politics. Okay, so this is what he sees as the birth of identity politics. This, again, Fukuyama's a little insidious here, and so I don't want you to take Fukuyama's definition and characterization of identity politics as, I want you to take it as authoritative. He is certainly describing real phenomena, but again, the tone and ambiguity and vagueness with which he talks about these things is difficult and problematic. So public recognition, I want to go back to some earlier parts of the book to flesh out what he means by public recognition. So this is a big part of the book. And I think, this is where, this is sort of at the heart of the problem that I have with Fukuyama. though again, it's difficult to pin him down. So I can't quite articulate what the problem is, but there is a problem here. I first want to go to chapter 2, the third part of the soul. Okay, so this is very relevant to what Fukuyama, the way that Fukuyama develops his idea of dignity. And so he starts with an interpretation of the Republic by Plato. So Plato's Republic, in which Socrates is one of the main characters. So let's see what Fukuyama has to say. He says, the Republic is a dialogue between the philosopher Socrates and two young aristocratic Athenians, Adeimantus and his brother Glaucon, who were the brothers of Plato, older brothers of Plato, about the nature of a just city. After debunking several existing theories of justice, such as Thrasymachus's assertion that justice is nothing more than the self-interest of the strong, Socrates constructs a just city in speech, based on an exploration of the nature of the soul. That's a very good description that Fukuyama gives. The overall purpose of the Republic is to examine what is justice, what it means to be a just human being, to be a just individual. And as an analogy, he and his disciples construct a model city, a toy city in speech, just as a thought experiment, that then is sort of a model of the way that that a proper soul or a proper person should be organized so as to be a just individual. That kind of gets lost in most interpretations, and I think Fukuyama makes that mistake of losing the focus of the text, the Republic. But so far, so good. He's on target. The word soul, Greek psyche, is not much used anymore, but as the etymology suggests, the discipline of psychology essentially studies the same subject. The key discussion of the nature of the soul takes place in Book 4. Socrates notes that a desiring part of the soul seeks, for example, food and water. But at times, a thirsty man pulls back from drinking because he knows the water is tainted and could lead to sickness. Socrates asks, isn't there something in their soul bidding them to drink and something forbidding them to do so? Something different that masters that which bids. Adeimantus and Socrates agree, yeah, there's something different there. That this second different part of the soul is the calculating part. So you have the desiring part, the second part is the calculating part, and that it can operate at cross purposes from the irrational desiring part of the soul. So the calculating part and the desiring part may want to do different things, and so there's this negotiation that takes place within the individual. Socrates and Adeimantus have at this point described the modern economic model. The desiring part corresponds to individual preferences, while the calculating part is the rational maximizer. This is the way that most economists explain human behavior. While Sigmund Freud is no longer taken as seriously as he once was, this distinction corresponds roughly to his concept of the desiring id and the ego that kept those desires under control, largely the result of social pressures. But Socrates points to another type of behavior by relating the story of the Athenian Leontius, who passes by a pile of corpses left by the public executioner. Leontius wants to look at the corpses, but at the same time tries to avoid doing so. After an internal struggle, Within his soul, he looks, saying, "Look, you damned wretches, take your fill of the fair sight." Talking to his eyes, who just gravitate towards the carnage. Leontius, while tempted to indulge his desire to see the corpses, knew it was ignoble that he gave in to his cravings, aroused that he gave into his cravings, aroused his anger and self-loathing. Notice the use of anger here. So that is part of this third part of the soul, but it's this third part of the soul is very important, because if it's just the desiring part and the calculating part, it's hard to account for anger, especially righteous anger, feeling righteous indignation, and also self-loathing. Those are difficult to describe in terms of just desiring and calculating. Socrates asks, and this is a quote from the Republic, "In many other places, don't we notice that when desire forces someone contrary to the calculating part, he reproaches himself, and his spirit is roused against that in him which is doing the forcing? And just as though there were two parties at faction, such a man's spirit becomes the ally of speech." We could transpose this into a more contemporary example where a drug addict or alcoholic knows that another hit or drink is bad for him or her, but nonetheless takes it and feels a deep self-loathing for being weak. Socrates uses a new word, spirit. Okay, so we have the desiring part, the calculating part, and now we have this spirit. Socrates uses this word spirit to refer to the part of the soul that is the seat of this anger against oneself, which is a poor translation of the Greek word thumos. Socrates then asks Adeimantus whether the part of the soul that wanted not to look at the corpses was just another desire or was an aspect of the calculating part. Since they both pushed in the same direction, the former view would be the perspective of contemporary economics, where one desire is limited only by the calculation that another, more important desire supersedes it. Socrates asks, is there a third part of the soul? What we are now bringing to light about the spirited is the opposite of our recent assertion. Then we supposed it had something to do with the desiring part, but now, far from it, we say that in the faction of the soul it sets its arms on the side of the calculating parts. Quite so, Adeimantus responds. Is it then different from the calculating part as well, or is it a particular form of it, so that there aren't three forms in the soul, but two, the calculating part and the desiring? Or just as there were three classes in the city that held it together, money-making, auxiliary, and deliberative, is there in the soul two, this third, the spirited, by nature and auxiliary to the calculating part, if not corrupted by bad rearing? Adeimantus immediately agrees with Socrates that the spirited part, thumos, is neither just another desire, nor an aspect of reason, but an independent part of the soul. Thumos is the seat of both anger and pride. Now, here is an interpretation by Fukuyama that I would disagree with. He says that thumos is neither just another desire, nor an aspect of reason. Fukuyama, as many people do, conflate calculating with reason. And that's problematic because, especially in the Republic, Socrates and Glaucon go into a long discussion of segmenting out a calculating part from a higher form of reason ultimately what we see in the Republic and throughout the Platonic dialogues is that you can't achieve this higher dialectic form of reason unless you let Thumos take the lead. It's Thumos that gets you to the highest form of reason. And Fukuyama seems to totally miss that. But that, I think, in most interpretations, I mean, when I say most, people want to, well, some, but most of the people that I've had contact with in personal conversation or have read, like in these kind of interpretations, they miss that about Thumos actually being a necessary component of the highest end of reasoning, which is dialectical reasoning. It takes guts and courage to achieve dialectic. And Fukuyama really misses that, and I think that's really essential to why his whole discussion of identity politics and his notion of dignity that he develops is so insidious, because he's just thinking of Thumos as some kind of anger and self-loathing. He misses the part about it being guts, about being courage to take action and to act even when public recognition doesn't come. Thumos doesn't desire public recognition really at all, because when push comes to shove, Thumos says, fuck society. I'm going to stick to my guns. I'm going to have integrity. It's about integrity. And as an example of this, Socrates himself was put on trial for practicing philosophy. And he was given the opportunity to give up his integrity and to kowtow to the rich and powerful within the Athenian society. If he would have done so, he could have lived. He chose death rather than give in. It didn't matter that he was going to be disrespected by the state by being condemned to death as a heretic and, well, primarily as a heretic and an enemy of the state. That total negation of public recognition and really means Socrates allowed himself to be subjected to a public humiliation and denigration precisely because he had guts and integrity. He had thumos. I don't think Fukuyama can even understand that. And I think you'll see that at the end of the book as he begins to talk about dignity and public recognition. It's always about public recognition. That really doesn't fit with Socrates. Okay, so, but Fukuyama goes on to say, thumos is the seat of both anger and pride and integrity. But Fukuyama's missing that. Leontius was proud and believed he had a better self that would resist looking at the corpses. And when he gave in to his desires, he became angry at his failure to live up to that standard. More than 2 millennia before its advent, Socrates and Adimantius understood something unrecognized by modern economics. Desire and reason are component parts of the human psyche, or soul, but a third part, thumos, acts completely independently of the first two. And yes, that is true. Like Socrates, he could have calculated and said, well, I'll just give lip service and apologize for being a heretic and an enemy of the state, and they won't kill me. But he refused. He refused to admit any guilt. And that does go against this sense of calculation or very weak desire. But it doesn't really have anything to do with public recognition in the way that Fukuyama wants to talk about it and emphasize so much. Thumos is the seat of judgments of worth. Leontius believed he was above staring at corpses, just as a drug addict wants to be a productive employee or a loving mother. Human beings do not just want things that are external to themselves, such as food, drink, Lamborghinis, or that next hit. They also crave positive judgments about their worth. And this is like positive judgments from society about their worth or dignity. Those judgments can come from within, as Leonidas' case, but they are most often made by other people in the society around them who recognize publicly their worth. If they receive that positive judgment publicly, they feel pride. And if they do not receive it in public, they feel either anger when they think they are being undervalued, or shame when they realize that they have not lived up to other people's standards. So he does recognize that there's thumos can be internal, but he wants to say that primarily it's about external recognition. And I would deeply disagree with this. I think this is maybe the heart of what I have a problem with Fukuyama about. This third part of the soul, thumos, is the seat of today's identity politics. Okay, but remember what we read earlier, that identity politics is about wanting dignity for your group so as to achieve personal dignity. It's all about public recognition of one's group and therefore public recognition of oneself. But that just does not fit with what Socrates is talking about. And so, Fukuyama builds in a lot of interpretation here in order to, reach his conclusion at the end of the book. So he says, the third part of the soul, thumos, is the seat of today's identity politics. Political actors do struggle over economic issues, whether taxes should be lowered or higher, or how the pie of government revenue will be divided among different claimants in a democracy. But a lot of political life is only weakly related to economic resources. These are what sometimes are referred to as issues of class, right? Economic, distribution of economic resources. But identity politics, Fukuyama says, is not necessarily just about class and economic issues. He says, take, for example, the gay marriage movement, which has spread like wildfire across the developed world in the first decades of the 21st century. This does have an economic aspect having to do with rights of survivorship, inheritance, and the like for gay or lesbian unions. However, many of those economic issues could have been and were, in many cases, resolved through new rules about property in civil unions. But a civil union would have had lower status than a marriage. Society would be saying that gay people could be together legally, but their bond would be different from that between a man and a woman. This outcome was unacceptable to millions of people who wanted their political systems to explicitly recognize the equal dignity of gays and lesbians. The ability to marry was just a marker of that equal dignity. Now, I think this analysis is right about identity politics. Like this example, he gives a very good description of. In terms of identity politics, yes, the recognition does need to be public, but there's a lot more. There's a lot more going on. There's a much deeper thing going on that Fukuyama wants to kind of erase, because, I'm going to hold off on giving any more, because again, it's hard to pin him down, so I don't want to overstate the point. Okay, But he's doing a good job in describing identity politics around gay marriage. Okay. And those opposed wanted something of the opposite, a clear affirmation of the superior dignity of a heterosexual union, and therefore of the traditional family. The emotions expended over gay marriage had much more to do with assertions about dignity than they did with economics. Okay. This is, yes, true, and especially this left-right divide. But there's something, especially on the right-wing side of this argument, denying gay people the right to call their union a marriage, for it to be legally defined as such by the state. There's something that lacks integrity about that desire to deny that to gay and lesbian couples. And so while Fukuyama is talking about thumos, he loses the thread of the way it's bound up with integrity. Especially on the right-wing side of this argument, they seem to have lost their integrity, right? Similarly, the massive anger of women embodied in the #MeToo movement that emerged in the wake of revelations about the behavior of Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein was fundamentally about respect. While the way in which powerful men had coerced vulnerable women had an economic dimension, the wrong of valuing a woman for her sexuality or looks alone and not for other characteristics such as competence or character would exist among men and women of equal wealth or power. Okay. So those are two good examples of identity politics, where it is about dignity and recognition. So Fukuyama is right about that, but he wants to, by emphasizing this anger, this desire for public recognition, he wants to emphasize that so much that he kind of erases something that is absolutely fundamental for a philosopher. And that's the kind of thumos, courageous integrity that allows one to go against society, to shirk public recognition in order to do the just thing, which is precisely what the whole dialogue of the Republic is about. Okay. So Fukuyama is kind of using the Republic to undermine the main point of the dialogue. That's what I find very distasteful, and it's just, not just a thing about Socrates or Plato or the Republic. It has real implications in present day politics, because precisely what is missing is courageous integrity.